In this video, I'd like to do two things. First, to give some information about visual novel Oedipus/Antigone, which I developed for PC and Mac. What's it about, the choice of art direction, characters, etc. Second, I'd like to discuss the Theban cycle of Sophocles. The main themes, the background, why it is not a proper trilogy, and so on. So I hope it will be interesting, even if you're not planning to play, or more precisely, to read the Oedipus/Antigone game. Okay, let's go. Sophocles. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. Only 7 survived. I decided to make an adaptation of his 3 most famous plays, Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone, the so-called Theban cycle. One of the reasons why I decided to choose these 3 tragedies is educational. You are required to read these 3 plays in universities or in high school. A visual novel is a good alternative to a book or an audiobook, so it might be more engaging for students. And for those who already know the material, it is an option to reread the plays and to see the presentation, the direction. Plus, there is a soundtrack, which you obviously can turn off if you don't like this type of music. Another important factor is that the Theban cycle tells more or less the story of one family. So you can construct a narrative, a pseudo-trilogy. That's what everyone does. The 3 plays are usually bundled under the same book cover, even though, well, it is not a proper trilogy. Only one actual ancient Greek trilogy survived. That's Aristea of Aeschylus, composed of Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides. These are 3 interconnected plays that form a single narrative, and they were performed during the same festival. The Theban plays of Sophocles, on the other hand, are composed of tragedies that initially were parts of some other trilogies. They were written for different festivals. In fact, Antigone is the earliest play here, while Oedipus at Colonus is the latest. Actually, Oedipus at Colonus is one of the last plays of Sophocles. It was written when he was probably around 90 years of age. And Antigone was written a few decades prior. Scholars usually estimate that there is something like 40 years between Antigone and Oedipus at Colonus. So naturally, these plays kind of contradict each other. Not too much, but they do. The most famous example here is that Oedipus banishes himself from Thebes at the end of Oedipus the King. He tells Creon, who becomes a new king, I quote, "Cast me out of this land with all speed, to a place where no mortal shall be found to greet me." And in Oedipus at Colonus, we learn that Oedipus asked for exile, but Creon refused. And then, I quote, "But when my fierce anger had spent its force, and seclusion in the house was sweet to me, it was then that you thrust me from the house and cast me from the land." And also Creon is not really the king. Eteocles, the son of Oedipus, is the king. There are some explanations for that, but once again, Oedipus at Colonus wasn't intended as a direct sequel to Oedipus the King. Yes, Sophocles worked with the same mythological material, and he more or less kept in mind what he said in one of his previous adaptations of the material many years ago. But that's a separate work. Another important and frequently overlooked thing here is when it all happens and how old are the characters. It is more or less irrelevant when you read these tragedies, but it is something you start thinking about a lot when you're not only adapting the material, but you're adapting it in sequence. You start with Oedipus the King, the first play in terms of internal chronology, and then you immediately proceed to Oedipus at Colonus. You need to visualize it, you need to show it to the audience. So how old is Oedipus in Oedipus the King? And how old is he in the next chapter in Oedipus at Colonus? In the case of my visual novel, I need to create artwork that more or less reflects the age of the character. But you cannot be truly consistent here. because Sophocles wasn't consistent and we're not dealing with a proper trilogy. If you go and ask the classicists or directors to adapt this material for the stage, most of the time they will tell you something like, well, you know, Antigone is like 14 or 15 in Antigone. And the events of Antigone happened pretty much immediately after Oedipus at Colonus. And she's probably around 14 in Oedipus the King. Well, yes, but no, it is kind of impossible. And what about Oedipus? He's most probably around 40 in Oedipus the King. And in Oedipus at Colonus, he is, I quote, a blind old man. What is the time gap between the two plays? Some say that technically the gap should be less than a year. Probably even, well, how long does it take to go from Thebes to Athens on foot? It is around 80 kilometers, but he is old in Oedipus in Colonus. And how old is Antigone? I can spend the next 10 or 20 minutes discussing this, but in the end we're dealing with a material that doesn't care about any of that. Kind of like the mythological material about the Trojan War doesn't care much about the age of the characters. And since there was never one definitive version of the myth, you're gonna be in serious trouble when constructing a coherent timeline of the inherently contradictory story. I made a video about this some time ago. I mean, there is a great example of how screenwriters adapt the Trojan War for their film, and they pretty much always depict Paris, Alexander, as a very young man. But in fact, he's significantly older than, say, Achilles. He could be his father. And Achilles, in the 10th year of the war, has a grown-up son. So how old is Paris? He's not Orlando Bloom in Wolfgang Petersen's Troy. He's most probably 50. And Helen is around 50 as well. And that's not even the problematic part of the myth. This is actually quite straightforward stuff. There are moments when the timeline collapses. So the situation with Oedipus is a bit analogous to what I just described. And at a certain point, you're forced not to think about it too much. My Oedipus is 40 at Oedipus the King, and then he's a blind old man in Oedipus at Colonus, because the text says so. Antigone becomes roughly 10 years older. Creon is a bit older, but not too much, although at some point I actually reused one image of Creon from the first part, Oedipus the King, in the last part, Antigone. And yes, I consciously decided not to age Tiresias, the blind prophet, even though I've prepared some images of his older version, but I decided it contradicts the myth too much. You will never learn it from the tragedies of Sophocles, but Tiresias has a backstory, and one of the myths actually says that Tiresias lives 7 lifetimes. He doesn't really age that fast. He essentially stays an old man for, well, probably for hundreds of years. Depends on how you count a lifetime. Let's talk briefly about the 3 tragedies that are included in the Theban cycle, so we could have some context. These works are obviously hugely important and, just like the rest of ancient Greek drama, remain relevant up to this day. And no, I'm not implying that Oedipus the King is relevant because the idea of sleeping with mothers somehow became widely popular these days. Especially since it is not about sleeping with your mother and killing your father, it is mostly about fate, and the fact that you can't run away from your fate. In a way, this tragedy is quite deterministic in its nature. There are different interpretations of what's going on in these 3 tragedies, because some of the meanings and references are not self-evident. We don't live in Athens of the 5th century BC. It is not clear to us, for example, if Sophocles is referencing Pericles in Oedipus the King or some other events. And he most certainly does. For example, this tragedy was most probably written in the wake of the Plague of Athens, which started in 430 BC. And the play actually begins when the plague strikes Thebes and Oedipus is trying to figure out what's the cause. We don't know for sure, but it looks like a direct reference. And some other references are not that apparent. We don't have time to dissect all three tragedies in detail. People write books on the subject. And honestly, I don't really feel that I'm fully equipped to do it properly. But I'm equipped to give some overview. So, Oedipus the King, also known as Oedipus Rex, is sometimes hailed as the most important Greek tragedy of all time. By people like Aristotle, I should say. Even though contemporaries probably had a slightly different view. Sophocles didn't win the competition with Oedipus the King. There is a school of thought that Sophocles actually invented this idea that Oedipus blinds himself upon learning the truth about himself and his parents. And the whole process of this blinding is a bit deeper than it might seem. For example, there seems to be a deliberate pun on the name of Oedipus. As you know, the etymology of the name Oedipus is essentially swollen feet, because his feet were pierced when he was abandoned by his parents. But you can construct a certain folk etymology of the name using the Greek word oida, which means both to know and to see at the same time. And in interpretation of Sophocles, Oedipus essentially begins to know when he is no longer able to see things. He becomes a bit like the blind prophet Tiresias, and actually in Oedipus at Colonus, it is quite clear that Oedipus now has clairvoyance, prophetic powers. Even if Oedipus at Colonus, once again, is not a real sequel to Oedipus the King, it is obviously linked thematically and expands the story. This is where Oedipus more or less gets his atonement for the sins which he committed unknowingly, and thus not entirely guilty of them. He fully accepts his fate and suddenly becomes not a pollution, not an unclean presence for the city, but a boon, a holy man. And that's why Thebes suddenly wants Oedipus back. But Oedipus knows that he needs to stay in Athens and his remains will become some kind of an artifact that gives protection to the city. Well, because all of this is staged in Athens and for the Athenian audience. Colonus, by the way, was most probably the birthplace of Sophocles. It used to be a village near Athens, but now it is basically in the city center. Plato's Academy was located in Colonus, and it takes roughly 30 minutes to walk from Colonus to the Agora of Athens. It also must be noted that it is believed that Oedipus at Colonus also reflects personal struggles of Sophocles, as well as general struggles of the Athenians, since the work was written when Athens was losing the war. We all know that Sophocles had a very happy life, but we have this anecdote that when he became really old, one of his sons decided to declare Sophocles senile and incapable of managing his estate. They went to the court, and Sophocles, who was 90 at the time, decided to read out loud the fragments of the tragedy he was writing at the time, Oedipus at Colonus. The judges and the jury listened to this. They were stunned by the quality of the material and declared that it is absolutely apparent that Sophocles had a very clear mind, and in fact, the crazy person here was probably his son. So if this anecdote is true, no wonder that Oedipus in this tragedy basically curses both of his sons. One usurps the power in Thebes, while the other brings foreign army to attack the city. Antigone, as previously discussed, was written long before Oedipus at Colonus, when Sophocles was still a relatively young 50 or 55-year-old man. At the center of Antigone, we can see this prominent subject of Greek philosophy, the conflict of physis and nomos, the conflict of the natural law and the laws of the people. Creon, in his hubris, decides to trample the natural law, the law of the gods, And everyone pays the price for that. And first of all, Creon himself and all of his family. Essentially, Creon, not Antigone, can be seen as the main tragic figure of this play. He stays alive, but he loses everything. And yes, hubris is obviously also one of the most prominent themes of the play. Well, it is one of the most prominent themes in ancient Greek drama and mythology in general. Creon becomes the king of Thebes and suddenly decides that he's above everything and just tramples the tradition, the law of the gods, and explicitly forbids to bury Polynices, because Polynices was a traitor and the enemy of the state. He even ignores the fact that Polynices was his close relative and a citizen of Thebes. And then he persists in his hubris when he condemns Antigone for ignoring Creon's absurd and unjust legislation, because he doesn't want to look weak and create a dangerous precedent. Now, the production of the Oedipus/Antigone game, in case you're interested. As I've mentioned before, there's this educational dimension to the game. So right from the start, I decided that I'm gonna use the parallel text in ancient Greek. Once again, visual novels are a genre of games when you're basically reading an illustrated story. I actually had this idea of using two translations simultaneously, one in prose and another in verse, and the text in ancient Greek. But then I came to my senses, because 3 text boxes on a screen is a bit too much. So I used the text in prose, the translation by Richard Jebb, and I try to synchronize it more or less with the original Greek text, although it is not always easy because Attic Greek, or Attic Greek with the elements of Doric Greek for the chorus, well, it is structurally very different from English, which explains why sometimes I don't break the English text in the game evenly. Meaning, occasionally you can see that the text breaks mid-sentence and then continues on the next page. That's not because I'm lazy. In fact, the opposite is true. It would have been much easier to maintain the structure when you don't split sentences. But the most important thing here is the visuals. It is a visual novel, after all. So I have to say a couple of things about this. Obviously, I used AI to generate images while desperately trying to maintain consistency. And then I tweaked them manually. And all of this took a while. It is not press the button to get the result. Oh no. I honestly believe that it is a proper application of the technology. Not only because I'm the only developer of the game, the whole development team is me. I script, I design, I generate and tweak the images, I write the soundtrack, etc. But also because I chose a very peculiar art direction for the game. It is marble statues, damaged marble statues. I like the way they look and I try to create a certain atmosphere. This is pretty much how objects of material culture from classical antiquity came down to us. And this is how we frequently perceive classical antiquity. So if I had to do everything the traditional way, I'd have to hire a number of 3D artists and then sculpt and model everything using references. Spend a year doing all this and, more importantly, spend a sizable amount of money. But now, instead of giving references to modelers and then several rounds of feedbacks, I could just give the very same references to the machine and then tweak it until it will start driving me insane, which, given the current state of the generative AI, may happen pretty fast. It's going to be much easier next year, but right now, that's how it is. But the cat is already out of the box, and in case you don't know, everybody is using these tools in one way or another, even if they don't tell you. So in many ways, I end up with the comparable result, but without bankrupting myself. Which leads us to another important thing. This phrase about bankrupting myself is a figure of speech. It is not true. I've been in game development for a really long time, and I fully understand that the commercial potential of a niche game like Oedipus/Antigone is probably not very high, which automatically means that you won't be able to secure the budget for all this traditional production with 3D artists and stuff. And if you have the budget in your own pocket, chances are you won't invest it into something that most likely won't be able to break even. So it is a choice of creating this passion project and taking shortcuts to be as cost-effective as possible, or you're not making the game at all. And as you probably know by now, I really wanted to have this experiment of creating the first visual novel adaptation of ancient Greek drama ever. This is something that's quite dear to me. Come on, why else would I start 2 YouTube channels on classical antiquity? Thank you for your time. And don't forget to watch the video where I give an overview of the Greek theater and its history.